Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Fairwinds. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I will be moderating today's session. We have an exciting presentation ahead of us, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. First, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any of the session or you'd like to share it with a friend, the video will be made available on demand at the conclusion of the webinar. You'll receive an email after the webinar concludes with a link to access that on demand. Second of all, we are taking questions throughout today's session. So please, if you have any questions, submit them on the right side of your screen using the Q&A tab. On that right side of the screen, you'll also find the chat tab. This is going to be where you can engage with one another. You can talk to us, let us know from where you're tuning in. That's going to be on the right side of your screen. There will be a couple polls throughout today's session, so be sure to keep an eye out whenever we announce those to have your results included. And finally, our 4 $25 Amazon gift cards will be given away at the end of today's seminar, so stick around to make sure you're one of our 4 lucky winners. But on to today's webinar. The topic is tips we learned from achieving SOC 2 compliance applied to Kubernetes. And I'm joined today by Joe Pelletier, Vice President of Product Strategy at Fairwinds, and Andy Suderman, Director of Research and Development and Technology at Fairwinds. It is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Joe to kick us off. Thank you so much for being here with us today, guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Cody. I think we might have a polling question to kick things off here today. And really kind of that polling question is really, where are you on your Kubernetes journey? I think a lot of folks, might fit on one of these different spectrums. So let's see if we can get some poll results in here right now. And I guess, Cody, do you know if the poll is running?
The poll is running. The responses are filing in.
Sounds great. I think from Andy and ours experience, we find folks generally on a spectrum here, right? Especially as Kubernetes adoption is still on the rise. So it's always interesting to kind of check in and see where folks might be today.
Yeah, for sure. It's been interesting to watch it skew. I mean, about a year ago, I think it's definitely further on the A and B side of these things, planning or just getting into it, and very few production. I think over the last year or so, we've definitely seen it go much further towards the spread across the whole spectrum kind of look.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like we've got some results coming in now. And, looks like probably about half of the audience is either just learning about containers and Kubernetes or planning to use it in the next 6 to 12 months, while a good portion of the audience is also currently using in production. So that does feel sort of similar to what we've seen in the past. It's starting to look like Kubernetes is getting real production usage in a meaningful way, but there's still a lot of room to grow. And today we'll obviously be giving you some insight into how we have leveraged Kubernetes and how we've also had to tackle things like SOC 2 compliance. So moving on to slide 5 here. Let me just go ahead and move to the next slide. Really what we wanted to kind of start with is giving a really a high level overview of what is SOC 2, right? I think a lot of organizations may hear about this compliance requirement, and really it's a compliance standard that helps organizations prove to internal and external stakeholders that they're securing data and running their business according to best practices. And that information is really important not only for internal stakeholders, but for customers, partners, vendors, and investors. And increasingly, especially on kind of with software businesses too, a SOC 2 report can be really useful to help win new business and retain that customer trust. One of the things to know about SOC 2 is at a very high level, there are 5 trust principles that kind of revolve around that encompass kind of SOC 2 in general. And if we start with the first one, one of the trust principles is around security, and that really requires organizations to understand their systems and making sure that only authorized users have access to those systems. Moving forward, there's also availability requirements. So, a lot of times I think folks think about compliance as being just like a security thing, and security is a big part of that, but also availability is really key, right? You want to make sure that your systems are meeting their uptime requirements per the expectations that you set with your customers. And, ultimately availability is part of a good security posture as well. There's also processing integrity, which is making sure that any transactions are complete, accurate, authorized, and timely. Confidentiality requirements. So, some organizations might process PII, PHI, or even PCI type data, and you want to make sure that that data is remaining confidential. And then finally, privacy requirements. Obviously, there's lots of different privacy laws around the world, and wherever you do business in those different geographies or in those different locations, you want to make sure that you're handling data in accordance to those laws and any other commitments that you've made to your clients. There's also a lot of questions around what are the different type of SOC reports and which one is most important for my business. There's actually 3 different types of SOC reports. Today, we're going to talk about SOC 2, which is probably the most prevalent of the 3. And what it reports on is really, the trust principles that we talked about. It's making sure that organizations are aligned to those trust principles. And there's also a set of common criteria that we'll get into that help organizations kind of go deeper into understanding what parts of the SOC 2 scope is relevant for their organization. At Fairwinds, we actually recently became SOC 2 Type 2 certified. And as part of that, we had to start first with a Type 1 assessment, which was really assessing our controls in a point in time scenario. And that's what Andy will talk about in this presentation. And we also went through SOC 2 Type 2, which is really assessing control effectiveness over a period of time, such as like a 6-month period. So with Type 1, you get that point in time assessment. Does the architecture and design of your controls make sense for your organization? And then Type 2 makes sure that as time goes on, those controls are actually working properly. And with that, you do get a report that you can share under NDA with customers or vendors and things like that. And that's one of the artifacts that is produced out of a SOC 2 exercise. SOC 2 is not just something that one department is responsible for, right? I think depending on the size of your company, there may be a department that specializes around compliance, but even still, it's definitely a cross functional business exercise, right? And Fairwinds is a rapidly growing startup, and we had to involve a few different parts of our organization, like our HR, IT operations, our management team, as well as our IT and customer success teams as well. So there are lots of different departments that are involved. And what you'll notice here is on the common criteria, there's 9 different kind of common criteria categories. You can see that there's different departments that are usually involved, based on what's being asked. So a really good guide for anyone who's looking to understand who do I need to involve as I move forward with SOC 2. Another thing to understand about SOC 2 is it does come with, a set of common criteria, and each of those common criteria areas have focus areas. So those focus areas help you understand sort of the implementation details needed in order to achieve that specific criteria. And that's important when you go to select different tools or different controls and try to understand, what do I have to change about my process, or what tools do I have to select in order to make sure that I'm aligned to compliance. And I'll share some of those examples later today around common criteria and how it relates to Kubernetes. But with that said, I'm going to give Andy some time here to share a little bit around the tips we learned from achieving SOC 2 compliance. Andy was one of our lead folks running that effort. And so we'll go ahead and turn it over to you now, Andy.
Thanks, Joe. It's a great overview of just getting us all on the same page. What is SOC 2? So as Joe said, I was largely responsible for our compliance program here, where we recently achieved our SOC 2 Type 2 certification and got our report. And there's kind of 5 main steps that I identified that are important to getting your report completed and getting through the whole process. So we'll start with the very first thing, which is ownership. And if you're like us going into this process, you have a lot of different systems. You got a lot of different things that you use. You've got a lot of different SaaS vendors that you work with. You've got all kinds of different tools that you use. You probably have, one or more cloud providers or things like of that nature that you're working with. And so really the first thing is to really understand what all of those are. Again, if you're like us, you probably have, some folks in marketing that signed up for an account over here, and you have some folks in IT or in engineering that sign up for accounts over here. And you really need to gather all that information and bring it together and understand not just what all those systems are, but who's responsible for them, who signed up for the account, who's managing the users, who's got admin, who doesn't. And this, quite frankly, can be, really tough if you've grown organically over time and you're just getting into this process. So, if it's something that you're going to get into eventually, maybe start thinking about that sort of thing now and having an understanding of what all those systems are. So make that list, get all those systems together, understand who's responsible for each one. Those people are now your compliance team. And maybe that team's too big. Maybe there's too many people involved in it, and it's time to hand over management of some of those systems to, one or more people and to consolidate that team. So this is a good opportunity for you to get that team to the proper size and understand who's in charge of everything.
Andy, when you were kicking off that effort, did you kind of initially realize that the team might have been bigger than you thought? And how did you kind of rationalize and bring it down to, something that was able to manage and execute the program going forward?
I mean, we didn't have too many folks. I mean, we're relatively small still. And so there were probably only 5 or 6 people that were, primarily in charge of those systems. I think we ended up kind of giving access to 1 or 2 people to an additional system to be admin on it. But really wasn't too bad, honestly, from our perspective. I would say, most teams function best at 5 or 6 people in general. So going beyond that, if you've got 15 people that all are in control of different systems, it might be time to consolidate. So
makes sense.
Definitely be my advice there. So we can go on to the next slide. Next step is all around best practices. So you may be following a lot of best practices. I know we were when we got into this process. We had a lot of these things in place, but now's the time to verify that you're following these best practices and start recording and understanding where you are and aren't and where your gaps are. So, some of these best practices that are incorporated in just about all compliance programs out there, using single sign-on for everything that you can, just about everything supports, your Google sign-on or a SAML provider or something like that. Utilize that wherever possible. And where you can't, make sure you've identified, is that okay? Is this a system that's, we consider in a data classification that does not require SSO, and are we okay with that? The next thing, encrypting everything, data stores, S3 buckets, EBS volumes, RDS instances, any other databases you have, making sure that your vendors that you're using are following encryption. And this is where kind of the whole SOC 2 trust thing comes into play. If your vendor has a SOC 2 report, you can verify that they're encrypting all of their data stores, or a lot of places have a privacy or security statement out there that you can see what they're doing, what they're not. And so I know, going through this process, we found, all of our engineers by default think to encrypt things, but there's things that you miss. There's little bits here and there, things that you thought weren't important or just got missed at the time. So start verifying those things. Make sure you're using TLS wherever possible. Use those HTTPS endpoints. Are you reviewing your access to all of your systems? Who has access to all of those systems we identified in step 1? And do they actually need that access? Do they have the appropriate level of access? Are we restricting level of access based on what they need to do their job and using that principle of least privilege? And then, moving past just the basic security requirements, Joe mentioned one of the trust principles, or what was the term you used? Sorry. the trust principles was reliability. So do you have a highly available system? Do you understand where it's highly available, where it's not? Do you have a DR strategy? Do you have a continuity plan? Do you know what will happen if certain things go down? Are you aware of that? And then moving past that into development processes and deployment and CI/CD. Do you have change management in place? Do you have, are you using pull requests? Do they have to be approved? Are you running tests on those pull requests? And does all that stuff have to pass before you can deploy it into production? Who has the ability to deploy to production? Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, I was going to say, as you describe a lot of these requirements, you kind of, in the back of my mind, I'm starting to say, there's Kubernetes concepts that sort of map into these as well, right? Like even just being able to control access control, for example.
Definitely. Who has access to your Kubernetes environment? Who can deploy to your Kubernetes environment? How are you deploying your Kubernetes environment? Is your Kubernetes environment configured to be highly available? If we go back to that piece of it, is it cross availability zone if you're in a cloud provider? Do you have the ability to spin it back up later down the road if you lose it in an entire region? Going back to that DR and continuity concept. So a lot of these definitely apply to Kubernetes. Actually going back to the very first one I talked about, encryption, turning on encryption on all of your root volumes for your various, Kubernetes nodes. Is that enabled by default? Is it not? So, and then the third thing that we'll talk about a little bit here, probably not as long, is security scanning. Do you have some sort of security scanning in place at multiple levels? So it's not enough to just run, a one-time scan against all your endpoints and see if there's vulnerabilities out there. You really want to be doing multiple things. So the first that we implement in our Insight software is checking all of our container images running in our cluster for known vulnerabilities. So we're running those in CI/CD. So before we even deploy, we're running those checks. We get notifications in our pull requests and we see, okay, there's a CVE in this container. Maybe we need to change a base image. Maybe we need to update a library that we're using to mitigate that before we even deploy it to the cluster. But then on top of that, running that over time against the images in our cluster that may or may not get deployed frequently to make sure that no additional CVEs have popped up over time. So that's directly applicable to our Kubernetes infrastructure. And then outside of your Kubernetes infrastructure, in addition to that, thinking about how you're scanning your whole environment. We started using Amazon's CloudWatch inside of our Amazon environments. There's lots of other products out there for scanning the rest or monitoring the rest of your infrastructure. And that's definitely a key piece of most compliance frameworks.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times when folks say security scanning, right, like it's a very broad category. There's lots of different kind of angles that you need to be able to assess, right? Like you mentioned, we're testing our container images. We also have to make sure that our infrastructure as code artifacts like YAML files and Helm charts, which are used to deploy applications to Kube, they're following best practices. We implement our own code scanning as part of our development process. So scanning is varied, both in terms of the things that are in the development process, but also from a production standpoint, making sure that you can, identify misconfigurations based on, changes in the production environment.
Absolutely. It's a very broad topic, and it's not just broad in what you can scan for, but it's also broad in where you scan. It's talking about that top to bottom approach from your CI/CD all the way into production, as well as your images. And then also we didn't mention, Falco runtime scanning to watch for, things doing things they shouldn't be doing inside of your Linux containers. Yeah, inside of your Linux environments. Great. And then, one thing we've talked a little bit about already, but, having those scans done in your CI/CD process, but really understanding your development and deployment process from beginning to end. So know, what does it take to get a change from development to production? Who has the ability to do that? And does everybody have to follow these rules? So this is one place where I think a lot of people get caught up. Is it's very easy when you have, 3, 4, 5 developers for, one or two of those people or all those people to be responsible for deploying to production. And you don't really see that, you have these processes, you have, checks going in CI/CD, you have things that can't be merged, but we're all admins. And so we can just push those changes through. And so how are we enforcing that workflow, even for the super users? Where do we have break glass functionality that allows us to push quickly into prod? And how is that monitored, and how are we auditing that as well? And so it's not just about understanding how we develop and deploy and what tests we're running, but also who has the ability to do that and how is it audited? I think that's a super important one as well. What we ended up doing in one case was we realized that, one person had the ability to, admin merge a PR, which would get deployed into production, and then really erase any evidence of having done that because they have admin access to the repos and things like that. And so technically one person could go make, a bad change or something like that, and then completely cover their tracks, which from an audit perspective is not ideal. And so we ended up adding another process that essentially watched our production environment and just notifies us on changes. And that's controlled in a completely separate environment from that one particular super user. And so we have that audit trail that can be followed back for all changes, even if we had to make, emergency administrative changes. Yeah. And so I think that's a really tricky one for folks. And I think people get caught up on that frequently.
That's a great example.
Thanks. And so we've talked about a lot of things that you have to do, a lot of things you have to change, but then SOC 2, the real meat of it, like, we're doing all this great stuff. We've got these good deployment processes. We're scanning for security, but now we have to say what we're doing. We have to document all of these policies. We have to say we're doing this. And that can be pretty onerous. It's a lot of policy writing. It's a lot of documents. And so this is the point where we really leaned on a third party. So we worked with a company called Content, and they have a SaaS offering that allowed us to generate these policies, share these policies internally, publish them internally, and then also keep track of how we're following them and provide evidence for that. So this is what the auditor is going to look at when they want to see that we're SOC 2 compliant. So not only do we have to do this stuff, we have to say we're going to do it, and then we have to keep doing it. And so that's, we said 5 steps, but really this is like 90% of the SOC 2 process.
And that's really the evidence gathering process, right? Being able to show that, the control is designed in the appropriate way and that you've been following the requirements of that control for that 6-month period of assessment, right?
Exactly. Yeah. SOC 2 type 1 is putting all of these things in place, and SOC 2 type 2 is providing the evidence that you continued to follow them over the 6-month period, the observation window. And so this is, I can't say enough about the third party vendor we use, because there are automated checks that automatically check some of the things like that we have encryption turned on for our S3 buckets and that they're not publicly accessible. But then there's also for all the stuff that's, a little bit more manual, you just take a screenshot and say, these are the users that we have in this system, and put it in there. And then the auditor has access to that as well. And they can come back and say, hey, can you show me that you're following the process for, these changes? So like an example of like development changes going out to production and following our established procedure for making changes. Basically, we provided a list of changes. The auditor said, okay, show me the evidence for these 5. And we just upload them into the platform. Auditor sees it, and we're good to go.
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, because like even when we were looking at Kubernetes from a SOC 2 perspective, there were definitely some things that we felt, we could automate the evidence collection, but other parts of it are, having to make sure that you're touching a number of systems or being able to document a number of different processes in place. And so it definitely is not a fully automated exercise, but where automation can help, it can definitely help save a lot of time, it sounds like.
Exactly. I don't think we'll get to a point where it's 100% automated. Right. It's always going to be a give and take between some manual and some automated. As much as we can automate is great, but also just facilitating that collection and having a place where we can see that report, which I know you're going to talk a little bit about how we took that that
Right.
learning and implemented it into our insights platform and use it to inform our decisions for this.
Yeah, exactly. And so, part of what we wanted to share with the audience today is a little bit of like, when it comes to SOC 2 and Kubernetes, if you're running Kubernetes in production, and we know a large group of folks are today, what are the considerations that you should take into account? And there's actually a lot of different considerations. We're going to cover just a handful, but that was sort of the approach that we wanted to share today. So, Fairwinds, we do develop software, and I'll speak a little bit about the software that we develop. And part of our software can actually help with compliance requirements like SOC 2, or even if you're a company that is exposed to ISO 27001 or HIPAA type requirements, there's a number of different considerations for Kubernetes as well. And when we went through the process, we looked at our own Kubernetes infrastructure and had to ask the question, which of the common criteria, and we shared the 9 different sections earlier, which of those common criteria are relevant, for our situation? And what we've developed recently is a self-assessment capability so that we can help guide our customers on the best way to meet their common criteria and those specific focus areas that we had highlighted. And what I'll kind of jump to next is just a couple examples of how we do that. But before that, I wanted to share a brief moment about Fairwinds Insights, which is our, what we call our Kubernetes governance and security software, which provides integrations into the CI/CD process to scan your container images and your Kubernetes configuration so that you're secure, efficient, and reliable. And we also provide runtime scanning as well. A few of the areas that we focus on, like I mentioned, security and compliance is definitely a key area. We do help organizations enforce policy and guardrails as well. And for some folks, there's a need to also gain visibility into the cost of their workloads and find ways to optimize and save more money with their infrastructure. So, Fairwinds is really focused on solving a few of these key cloud native challenges, and security and compliance is one of the areas that we hear the most from our clients today. As I mentioned, we do have a number of different integrations as early as, the Git workflow where you're checking in and making a pull request on a change, all the way through to the running Kubernetes infrastructure. And we'll provide DevOps integrations as well as, different cloud integrations with service, cloud providers like AWS as well. But let's jump into some of the common criteria, right? When we think about the SOC 2 requirements, right? There's a couple sections, namely section 6 and section 7, which have a number of different areas around kind of logical and physical access to systems that are important for in the Kubernetes realm as well. So if we look at kind of a common criteria 7.2 as an example, there's a need here to be able to have a system that, monitors for anomalies. And, they ask you to set up filters to analyze those anomalies so that you have some automation in place, because it can be a very heavy effort to do it manually. And one of the cool things about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, or CNCF, is that they have a project called Falco that can run in your Kubernetes cluster to identify unusual system activity or suspicious types of events, like, for example, maybe certain file systems being accessed, or network connections that look unusual, or maybe a shell being opened up, and automatically alert you when those types of activities or events are being found. And so leveraging a tool like Falco is a great way to be able to kind of align yourself to this requirement if it's something that's in scope for your specific scenario. We actually recently announced support for Falco integration with the Fairwinds Insights software. So we're helping our customers today make it easy to turn on and run that software. The other kind of example I want to share is infrastructure as code. So, a lot of organizations are shifting to an as code mindset. They're leveraging tools like Terraform to move all of their infrastructure to an as code design. And if you're running Kubernetes today, you're already leveraging infrastructure as code, right? Because you need to be able to maintain things like Helm charts and YAML files that configure how your Kubernetes infrastructure is run. We have an open source tool called Polaris, which you can find at GitHub on our GitHub page. And Polaris is a great tool for being able to analyze your Helm charts and your YAML files for a variety of different misconfigurations. We have a dozen or so different security related type checks there that can help you make sure that your configuration files are not running in privilege mode, or they're not running as root if they don't need to be. And that gives you an opportunity to test system changes, so that if you're making changes to those files, you now have a tool called like our Polaris tool to be able to audit that. I'll give a demo of a little bit of how we integrate Polaris today in our Fairwinds Insight software so that you can get that same experience. The next area I wanted to share is Andy mentioned this around vulnerability scanning, how is as part of our own development process, we scan our containers for known vulnerabilities. Container vulnerability scanning is one of the considerations for meeting common criteria 7.1, and that is a criteria that's really focused on like detecting and monitoring any sort of changes to configuration or files so that you can avoid introducing new vulnerabilities. Now, the reality is, with Kubernetes and container technology, all that, it's a very ephemeral environment. You want to make sure that the applications that are being deployed to Kube are, compliant and secure from the start. You want to make sure that your compliance and security is being built in as early as the development process. So a key integration stage, for container vulnerability scanning is, at the build time. That said, it's also important to kind of monitor your running containers in Kubernetes in case a new vulnerability is announced. So more recently, there was actually a Log4j vulnerability that was announced. I think a lot of folks may be familiar with that. And that's an example of a container that you may have thought was free of any vulnerabilities, immediately becoming insecure because a new vulnerability is announced, and you want to be able to quickly identify where's your exposure in your Kubernetes environment for that vulnerability. And so we really believe that vulnerability scanning needs to occur not only in the development process, but in the runtime in your Kubernetes cluster, so that you can identify which containers become vulnerable as a result of new announcements like the Log4j issue. And so, with our Fairwinds Insight software, we do provide integrations both on the development side and in the runtime, so that you can kind of achieve that best practice. Another great example is the role-based access control. As we talked about one of the earlier trust principles, security trust principle, a lot of it is around making sure you only have authorized access, right? And making sure that there's no one on the system who shouldn't have you don't allow unauthorized access, for example. And in Kubernetes, there's a whole RBAC, or role-based access control, mechanism built in to the core of Kube. And it's important to audit, for different types of system accounts and user accounts that might have access to various parts of the cluster, whether it's the whole cluster or maybe certain sensitive namespaces that, you want to really control who has access to the applications there. And with Fairwinds Insights, we do provide a way to audit your RBAC controls and flag the ones that are inherently risky. So those might be kind of RBAC profiles that could escalate their own permissions, or have broad access to do a number of things inside the cluster. And maybe a question for Andy is, like, as part of your SOC 2 review, how much of analyzing the RBAC within Kubernetes was part of that process? Was that another system that you had to analyze as part of the SOC 2 review?
Yeah, definitely. We didn't spend a ton of time on that. We don't tend to give a lot of production access to it. So, but definitely, analyzing who has what access, very applicable. Yeah,
I mean, it sounds like we've already kind of implemented best practices from the start, but we do know that in some organizations where there's lots of clusters, there might be a variety of different, might be lots of folks with access or just a few, and it depends on sort of what that starting point for that organization may have been. But nonetheless, auditing, making sure that, yep, you are following that principle of least privilege and gathering evidence around that, that's something that our clients can use our Fairwinds Insight software to do as well. The final one I want to kind of share is section 6.8, which is around kind of detecting unauthorized changes to software and configuration parameters, right? This is fairly broad. I think there's a number of different ways that you could get after this one. First with we mentioned runtime threat detection with a tool like Falco. That's monitoring for suspicious or anomalous behavior. That's definitely one way you can show how you're meeting that. Another approach is leveraging, a technology called admission controllers. So a unique feature of Kubernetes is the ability to kind of analyze the configuration of an application right before it's deployed. And because with that analysis, you have this opportunity to either reject it, so that if that application doesn't meet certain requirements, it can be denied deployment to Kubernetes. Or if it does meet the requirement, let it in and start running. And so being able to have a set of requirements that say, at a minimum, we want to make sure applications aren't set to run in privilege mode, or they have memory requests set so that we don't run into availability issues. Those are a few areas where you can leverage admission controllers to prevent misconfigurations or, misconfigurations around container updates from getting into the cluster. So there's a number of different ways that you could, tackle this particular common criteria, and a few of these capabilities are kind of out of the box with Fairwinds Insights too. So with that said, I just shared a couple different examples of the common criteria that we've analyzed at Fairwinds and how it can map into Kubernetes. There's a number of different other, general best practices that operators of Kubernetes you should be mindful of, such as being able to set resource requests and limits, and being able to kind of integrate into development workflows. So at this point, I'm going to just share a brief demo before we turn it over to Q&A. So let me go ahead and, it looks like I'm going to have to, I don't think I can actually do a demo today because I didn't give the right permissions to Zoom. So I don't want to, I don't want to be able to kind of exit the presentation that way. But if you are interested in the demo, we'll actually can point you to a great link at the end of this presentation that will give you a live demo and learn more about the product. So I think before we wrap up, we have one last polling question here, and we'll go ahead and just kick that off. Looks like the results are still coming in. We do see a variety of, this is always an interesting question because it stretches a little bit of best practices, really understanding the security of Kube, or even just helping with business, business level items like being able to get visibility into workload costs or save money. There's a variety of different challenges that I think folks experience with Kubernetes, a few months into their journey and start realizing what it's going to take to run Kubernetes infrastructure.
I do feel like, typically in the, going back to the earlier poll where we talked about kind of over time, the change, I think it's interesting, improving reliability is usually pretty high up there. Definitely a little lower today. I'm sure the topic of the webinar today affects that.
A little biased.
Biases a little bit, but yeah. I imagine it's also very hard to pick one.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the examples we did share were security oriented, but as with SOC 2, there is it is broad, right? It's around those 5 trust principles. I think with Kubernetes, there are a lot of really important security considerations because, there are scenarios where Kubernetes is not secure by default, right? And so I think when organizations do start approaching SOC 2, they are trying to understand kind of the unknowns around Kubernetes security, and that's where we've seemed to be helping our clients more these days. Well, great. I think as a final kind of bit of information, we recently created in 2021 a benchmark report And this is a really interesting report. We've been able to analyze hundreds of companies and their Kubernetes configuration. And we have provided some visibility into the trends that we're seeing around Kubernetes configuration, both from a security perspective, but also from how efficient and reliable is configuration today. And there's a bunch of great anecdotes here for y'all to be able to read and learn about what to take back to your teams to make sure that you're aligning to best practices. And like I mentioned, that we do have a great demo that you can request on our website. And we also have a kind of an interactive sandbox that you can use in order to test out the software without signing up too. So we have some pretty cool resources we can share with you all after the call. But that said, I think we can transition to Q&A.
Definitely. We've got a couple questions here, and one of them I think you will definitely. Two of them are kind of related, but one of them is I can see Fairwinds is mainly for CC6 and CC7. How will that apply to other controls as well?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think when we started looking at Kubernetes and containers itself, I mean, I think we found that common criteria 6 and 7 had the most applicability. I think there is some applicability to other common criteria, but we're really taking, I guess, a fairly focused view on container and Kubernetes technology. What does it mean for SOC 2? That's not likely going to be the end all for that's probably, your scope is probably much broader than that, and there's going to be other considerations. But we've been really trying to help our clients understand, help me, I have to go through SOC 2 and I use Kubernetes today. What should I know that may not be obvious? And that's been sort of the approach that we've taken.
Definitely. And then another one that I can take on, will this be applicable to other compliance frameworks? And, I think it's a really great question. Something that the partner that we worked with does, which I really like, is they take a lot of these controls and they map them across the different frameworks. So I have a pretty good view into how we're doing against some of the other frameworks, some of the, the HIPAA or the ISO 27001 frameworks. And there's definitely a lot that crosses all of them. And I think going back to those best practices I talked about earlier, those really are, because they're industry best practices, because they're things that you should be doing for security and reliability across any environment that you're running in production. I think they do apply to most, if not all, compliance frameworks. It gets a little bit weird when you start talking about different frameworks because they all define things in different ways and they all have different, prescriptions and not prescriptions about how you do things. HIPAA is notoriously not prescriptive and about how you do things. It just says you have to do certain things. And so I do think those best practices apply to all of them, but they may not directly map into the different frameworks.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. There's definitely overlap, but also some kind of unique aspects too. I think we have a question around, does Fairwinds offer anything to help with SOC 2 compliance? Short answer, yes, we do have our Fairwinds Insight software where you can get a demo there. It does have some mappings to SOC 2 in terms of capabilities that our product can map to, as well as general questions that you should consider as part of your SOC 2 journey. So I think there's definitely some ways we can help you with that. Where can someone go and learn more about SOC 2 compliance in Kubernetes? We do have a great blog on our website about this, and obviously this presentation is one of them. I think that's something we could share probably after this call. But that's definitely one great starting point. We try to use that as a guide to help customers learn about how Kubernetes and SOC 2 relate. And in our product, we do ask about 30 plus different questions to help customers scope down the parts of Kubernetes that might be most relevant to them.
Great.
And Andy, do you want to take this last question here?
I'm not entirely certain I understand the question.
Is it true that the controls we are talking about here are mainly for detective purposes? So yeah, I'm not exactly sure either, but I think there definitely are some examples that we shared which are about detecting types of either problems like vulnerabilities or misconfigurations or suspicious type of activity. There are, in many scenarios, ways to quickly remediate that. So we do provide remediation guidance with a lot of the findings. Like for example, fortunately with Kubernetes configuration, a lot of the fixes are fairly straightforward. They usually mean, in securing your Kubernetes configuration by adding the right security context, which is a few lines of YAML, or with container images, it might mean updating to the latest base image to resolve a handful of vulnerabilities. So there's fortunately fairly straightforward ways to remediate, but a lot of the tooling that we talked about today is about kind of detecting. So I'm not sure if we have any other questions at this point. Maybe turn it back to Cody.
Well, sure thing. While we wait for just a few more questions to come in, give anybody a chance to send those in, I'll go ahead and announce our Amazon gift card winners, and then I'll give you guys a second to close out. So our 4 Amazon gift card winners, they'll be receiving $25 gift cards. Our first winner is Kevin D. Our second winner is Elliot T. Our third winner is Anushka S. And our fourth winner is Kieran L. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't find an email, just check your spam folder. I think we received one more question. I'll go ahead and pop it into the Q&A box for you guys if you want to check that out.
Can you speak to special consideration with open source? That is a good question. I don't know if I could speak to any specific consideration. I mean, we have talked a lot about Kubernetes, and it is obviously open source. I think, the things that apply to closed source apply to open. It's just that with open source, I can go make the change to fix it if I really want to. I know that's not always the solution, but I don't know if I could speak to any specific considerations for using open source technologies versus not. Obviously, here we use a ton of open source, not just Kubernetes, and so I don't think I have anything much more to add to that in that arena. Joe, do you have anything?
No, I think that's the right point, Andy. At a very high level, I think of open source can also become vulnerable, and so it's important for the processes that we talked about to consider your use of open source as well, right? Like there may be misconfigurations, there may be known vulnerabilities, and that's also important for making sure that you demonstrate compliance processes as well. But yeah, I think you nailed it on the head there, Andy.
Okay. All right.
Perfect. Did you guys have any closing remarks before I close us out today? Any last thing you wanted to let the audience know?
No, thank you for the questions and thank you for the time. We have some great resources on our website, the benchmark report, and we also have a number of ways you can evaluate our software. So looking forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for listening and thanks for having us.
Awesome. Well, Joe and Andy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I just want to remind our audience that the session was recorded. So following this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access the on-demand recording. You'll also be able to find it living on the DevOps website if you visit devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. And so Joe and Andy, thanks so much for putting together this webinar. I would like to thank Fairwinds for sponsoring today's session. And I would also like to thank you, our audience, for being here with us for the entirety of today's program. This is Cody J. Brown signing off. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.